Board Game Hot Takes, the podcast where we give our immediate reactions to the hottest board games just minutes after playing them. My name's Tim.
And this is Chris.
This is Adam.
Today we're going to talk about the game we just finished playing, Root. But before we get into that conversation, I asked a poll on Twitter about asymmetric games. We're about to play Root, which is known for its asymmetric gameplay. And do you like asymmetry games? And if not, tell us why. The options I gave was number 1, I love it, and that came in at 38%. Number 2 was it's okay if used right, which is at 55%. That's an obvious answer. That was a pretty dumb poll question because, of course, if it's used right, it's okay. Number 3 was I have my concerns at 7%. And the fourth one was I don't like it at all at 0%. And this one shocked me because I don't think there's anything that you could ever ask about on the internet and have nobody not dislike it. So,
wow.
I bet if I put a poll out here and said, do you like fuzzy little kittens? I'd get a couple people that said I hate freaking cats on here. So,
do you like free money?
That was surprising. But obviously, we're about to talk about Root, which is an asymmetric game. And we're going to talk about, how we felt about Root specifically. But how did you answer this poll before we played Root tonight?
Yeah, so a surprisingly apt poll that ties into the game very much, Tim. And I put it's okay if used right, which was kind of the catch-all answer, like you said. But after playing Root, I would probably change my answer.
To what, Adam?
Well, don't give it away yet.
Yeah, I'll save that for later. But yeah, in general, I enjoy asymmetry. It's fun. It mixes it up.
Okay.
It gives a little bit of variance. So if Terraforming Mars, for the example, I always go to the factions have this just a little bit of asymmetry and kind of guide you, point you in a different direction to start things off. So it's a lot of games are like that. They give you a sort of a little nudge in a certain direction. So it makes you kind of want to explore certain avenues, certain branchings of strategy in a game. It gives you a nudge toward that way and a way to go. So I kind of like it in that regard. What about you, Chris?
I answered it the same as you did, Adam. I said that if it's done right, I enjoy it. And generally speaking, when I'm talking about asymmetry, I think probably similar to what you were saying. I like it when there are some differences amongst factions where it's not, not crazy asymmetry, but that there's some little bit, there's some minor differences. And then, of course, there are the occasional games like, I won't say what, but it's like you're playing an entirely different game than everybody else is. And that's a whole different thing. So I don't necessarily think it's even the same question.
No.
I think there's two potential scenarios there that you're talking about. But generally speaking, when I'm answering that question, I'm talking about games where, like Cthulhu Wars is probably kind of on the heavier end of asymmetry, where there's significant differences in abilities of the factions, but you're playing the same game. And I like that kind of thing, but it has to be done well. Otherwise, it just gets confusing and frustrating.
Yeah, and I wasn't really asking about that in this question, but it is hard to differentiate, especially in a Twitter post where you have very few characters to use. Because, there's asymmetric character powers or player powers. A lot of games even lead to asymmetry as you're playing the game, but they don't change the rules. Like, everybody's playing the same game, they just have different things they can do generally. When I was asking about asymmetry, especially, since we're talking about Root, I was talking about, like, truly asymmetric gameplay. I think the only other game that we've actually reviewed on here that has that level of asymmetry would be
Robotech Reconstruction.
Yeah, so that's kind of what I was referring to here. The way I answered it is I said I have my concerns. I think that there are some clever things going on there, but my biggest concerns coming into tonight and really, anytime thinking about a game that's that asymmetric is balance is one of the things. If you've got games that are being played completely different, how balanced are they? How hard is it to teach and get other people introduced into the game? That's probably my biggest concern with it. So there's some concerns I have about asymmetric gameplay. Let's see how it came out with Root. There's one other type of game I wanted to mention though tonight. Not a different type of game, but a game that introduced asymmetry in a pretty different way, because I think the way a lot of games handle the balance of asymmetry is they make them games where you can interact with the other players in a heavy way. So for example, in Root or Robotech Reconstruction, if somebody's unbalanced, multiple people go after them and they attack them. But there's one game that came out recently called Merchant's Cove that I think seems like a pretty clever idea. It's, I guess, a fairly simple like resource management trading game, but each player, the way they generate resources is a completely different mini game that's only available on their player mat. So I thought that was kind of clever that they tried to create a Euro, like a truly asymmetric Euro game. Don't know how well it worked out. I haven't played it, but it's something I would be interested in exploring versus just another asymmetric troops on a map combat game. Just a couple comments. So definitely a board game podcast said, I'm torn. I love the idea, but unless you play enough to get in repeat plays with each force, you're not going to get as much out of it. I don't usually play a game enough times to really explore the asymmetry. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's true. I think that's pretty accurate. I'll probably be talking about that a little bit tonight. Jordan Spike said they are great when you have a group that can play the game multiple times, so you're eventually trying to play the game well instead of just trying to play correctly. Also something that might come up in our conversation tonight. And then Kyle Frost from Give Pause Hobby on Twitter. The reason I love true asymmetry in player mechanics is that it forces players to take different paths to victory. In Root, everyone's still racing to 30 points, but the paths are wildly different. Makes for excellent in-game narrative and debriefing. So a little bit of a counterpoint there on what's cool about asymmetry.
Chatterbox had a decent quote who kind of echoed what you said. Harder to learn, harder to teach, harder to remember. If a game is super amazing and will entice you to replay and discover, it's worth it, and I massively appreciate the design and creativity in games that do it. Will always make a game a bit less approachable for her.
And I think she actually said something to the effect that Root was intimidating, which I can understand. I mean, I think that's a legit point.
Yep, very apt for tonight's discussion, I think.
Now we know what you all are thinking about asymmetric gameplay. Let's hear a description of Root, and you can hear what we thought about the game.
In Root, players take the role of one of 4 factions and vie for control of the wilderness. To do this, players battle, craft, build, muster, subvert, quest, roost, logisticate, patrol, squabble, or conspiratize their way to victory. What will you do? That depends on your faction. While each player can score points by removing opponents' buildings or tokens in battle, or by crafting items, the heart of gameplay of Root lies with the asymmetric gameplay of each faction and alternate, unique ways of scoring points for every player. The Marquita Cat begin the game as the woodland's policing, omnipresent force and score points every time they construct buildings. The Eerie Dynasties are the fallen former commanders of the forest, seeking to reclaim their prestige and score points based on a number of roosts they have on the map. The Woodland Alliance seek to gain sympathy amongst the discontent denizens of the wild and gain more points as their sympathy spreads. Finally, the Vagabond, a savvy, shifty, independent actor, scores points by improving a relationship with a faction or by removing a warrior belonging to a hostile faction. The Vagabond may also complete quests to score points. The first to 30 points immediately wins the game. Alternatively, the non-Vagabond factions may also achieve victory by what's referred to as dominance, by announcing their intentions to control specific regions on the board. If they control those regions at the beginning of any of their subsequent turns, they win the game. This is an extremely high-level description of the game, and I want to emphasize that at the core of Root, players are managing factions which operate under highly disparate rule sets. We played the base game tonight, but there are many expansion factions available as well as unique maps. Root is designed by Cole Worley with art by Kyle Farron and is produced by Leader Games.
All right, so we're back. Let's talk about gameplay and mechanisms of Root. Just a little background here. So I have played this game once, 4-player with the base factions prior to tonight, a couple of years ago, so it's been a while. And then tonight we played one time with the 4 base factions. Chris, this was your second play, right? But the first time you played, which was fairly recently, you played with like 2 of the base factions and 2 other ones. Is that right?
Yeah, there were 2 base factions. I was the Cats. I'm honestly forgetting what the second base faction was, because it wasn't. Honestly, I'm completely blanking on that because I don't feel like it wasn't the Birds, wasn't the Woodland Alliance. But in any event, it must have been the Vagabond, I guess, but I didn't think it was that too. Maybe there was 3 expansion factions. But I know we played the Cats, the Lizards, and the River Folk, the Otters. Yeah. So this was my second game.
What about you, Adam?
This is my third play. First time I was the Cats in like a 5 or 6 player game, which is wacky. Next time I was in a 3-player game. I was the Corvid Conspiracy. Those guys are cool. And this game tonight, I was the Eerie, the Birds.
all fairly new on it, but none of us were brand new tonight. We've all played it at least once before, so we had a vague idea of how the game played at minimum. So Chris, you want to start us out? Anything that stood out to you?
Well, I think the obvious thing to talk about first is just the asymmetry here. And it's so different from many games I've played in that the asymmetry is nearly absolute. There is an entirely different game being played by each of the different factions almost. I mean, there are some basic actions that are essentially the same. You can all move, you can all battle, things like that. But beyond that, the paths to victory, the paths to getting those 30 points are 100% different. So for the cat faction, which I played tonight, and incidentally, I played in my first game. I was kind of hoping to play a different faction tonight, but we did select randomly, and I ended up with the cats again. It's probably the faction that's the most traditional area control, where you're trying to build buildings, you're trying to take over as many spots as you can, and you get points for the buildings you put out for the area you control. It's pretty familiar. But for example, Steve was playing the Vagabond, and Tim, you were playing the Woodland Alliance. And I still, after 2 games of this, really don't have any good sense of what either of those factions are supposed to do. I even played a half a game online with the Vagabond in the Root app, and I still don't really have any idea what the Vagabond is supposed to do. So, that's really kind of the main thing, is that you can talk about a million different mechanisms because there's so many of them in this game if you bring in all the different various expansion factions into it. But it's the fact of the mechanisms being so different depending on the faction that you're playing that really kind of gives this game its feel and its character, I think.
Yeah, the asymmetry here, it requires a lot of upfront investment to be able to grasp the whole situation of the game and comprehend the global kind of what's going on with every faction, and to decipher the game state and who is in a good position to do what. It takes a lot of comprehension, a lot of, more comprehension than I have in 1, 2, or 3 games for sure, to totally grasp and to totally understand what you're supposed to do and see through the game and twist that to your advantage. So that's kind of a difficulty for me, is fighting through that. Do I want to take the time to learn what all these other factions do so I can be able to counter those or point them out to other players and say, hey, watch out for this. We need to counter this because Tim's about to sneak up and get a win here, or Steve is going to craft some stuff and give a speech over on this area over here. And I think I'm going to say it bugs me a little bit about Root is some of the things don't necessarily make thematic sense. The cats can build a sawmill and they can do the recruiting station. How come shouldn't it be like beavers that can like make a sawmill and make some wood? That would make a little more sense to me. I get it that it's all like cute stuff and awesome stuff that's happening, and you gotta assign certain actions to certain creatures, but there's just a big, I don't know, thematic disconnect, I guess, with woodland creatures fighting in a forest, which isn't really anything that happens in the real world anyway.
Well, not in this way. I mean, creatures do fight in the
scale,
forest.
yeah.
I think they.
Oh, it happens every
day. I get
day.
that there's predator-prey relationship out there. I understand that a little bit of wildlife. But the stuff that happens, I'm like, well, why are they doing that? I don't get it. These green guys have a fist and they can like do a suicide bomb over here. Okay, I don't know. So it's very opaque to me, this game, and I'm not quite sure still what is going on. Tim, what are your thoughts?
Well, it's funny. I mean, you're jumping into theme here, and I would say that that's probably one of the strengths of Root, to be honest. Like, I'm surprised that you're raising that as a concern, because in all honesty, I think that's one of the things that I actually really like about this game. But going back to the discussion about the asymmetry, it is very hard to know what's going on. We all went into the final round. 3 of us were at like 22 points, right? And you got to get to 30 to win. Chris was a little further back, so he was about to attempt a dominance check, which was cool that he was going to try that. But Steve just made 8 points on his last turn, and I had no idea that was even possible for him. Like, on a first couple plays, it's just impossible to understand how everything's working because everything works so differently. And I think that's a big challenge with this type of asymmetry, in that it really does prevent you from enjoying or really understanding how your first couple plays are going. I also think that's a big challenge with us talking about Root after playing it one time or even just a couple times. I think it's very hard to give it the justice it needs because of that. But I think it's worth mentioning that that's a big turnoff to me. I don't want to have to play a game 5 or 6 times before I actually feel like I can play the game competitively, or at least, try my best, or even understand what anyone else is doing. For me, that's still a frustrating experience. Listen, we talked last week about culling games because people have 50, 70, 100 games in their collection. How many people in our hobby with collections like that are playing a game 5 to 10 times in a short time period where you can actually get that enjoyment out of it? Obviously, a lot of people love Root. I don't see how I get there, and I don't see how most people are going to get there. But obviously, a lot of people have done that. So that's my feeling about the asymmetry with it.
There's no way I want to get there, Tim. Like like I said, the amount of upfront investment this thing requires.
Yeah.
So, if you do put in the buy-in, and so many people they buy into the system and they practice it and they research all the factions, and they know once you get to that point and you've done all this investment, well, you got to play it now. You already put 20 hours into learning how all these different factions do it. So you better put that practice into play and play this game some more. So I could see once you know it, and once you get everything clicking, then this game's probably rat. Like if it was the only game I had with all these 10 different factions on a desert island and the same group of 4 or 5 people to play with, then I would love this game. But there's so many options out there that makes it tough.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can totally understand. I think that's a legitimate concern because, normally when we have a game night, there's kind of an understanding now that there's not going to be somebody teaching the game, that you're going to go and you're going to watch a video to prep for it. And so usually one of us sends around a video and says, hey, this is the one you ought to watch to learn how to play the game. But unlike almost every game we've ever played, it's not enough to just understand the base game. It truly isn't. Even I'm going to keep coming back to Cthulhu Wars because it's one of those games that has a lot of asymmetry, but it's in the more traditional sense. And in Cthulhu Wars, you certainly give yourself a significant advantage if you really know the benefits of your faction and you know the benefits of the other factions as well. You're going to give yourself a tremendous advantage. If you go into Root not knowing how your faction works or how the others do, certainly how your own does, maybe not how the others, but you really give yourself no chance. You're not even going to be able to play the game because it's so complex and so different from faction to faction. Now, having said that, there's a lot of interest there too. And I know that there's a lot of people who love this game and are willing to put in that time and effort. In fact, the first game that I played was with a guy named Zach that I play with and a couple of others. And this is kind of their jam. This is a game that they play over and over again. And it's one of their favorites. And I can totally see, if you like the game that much, putting that investment in, this could be a very attractive feature because it really does give you an opportunity to play this really, really kind of crazy game where everybody's doing their own little thing. And that's kind of cool, but you have to be willing to put in the time and the effort, and it has to matter enough to you.
That's right. Okay. Well, let's jump into just a couple other things about the mechanisms that we found interesting. There's 2 I want to talk about. Let me start with Adam's faction was playing the Airy Dynasty, which is this bird faction. And basically the way you play it is that you start your turn every round by putting a card out into kind of a programming row. So you have 4 types of actions you're going to take. The cards all have 4 different suits on it. So you put one suit up in one of those rows. And that means you have to take that action the number of times equal to the cards in the row that match the suit. So if it's like a move action, you have to be moving from a space that has that suit. And if he can't do those conditions and meet those suits, then it all falls apart and there's a big mess for him. I think that's probably my favorite of the mini games that these factions have to do and the most interesting puzzle that's happening there. What do you guys think of that? Was there a different faction that you think were more interesting or more fun to play? And Adam, you're the one that actually played it tonight. How do you feel about that, the Airy Dynasty?
Yeah, I thought that was one of the coolest things about tonight's play for me was how that kind of worked and how you could shoot yourself in the foot if you weren't careful and you had to plan ahead. The bird cards, the 4th kind of wild card suit was extremely advantageous because it took away all restrictions relating to the map. If you had to move, actually you had to move from that suit to anywhere else. And with the bird suit in there, you could move from any spot to somewhere else. And same thing for recruit. It took away the restriction of having to recruit to that specific spot. But then if you didn't have the bird claw suit, the wild card suit, you had to be very careful about where you're going to move, where you're going to recruit to, where you're going to build one of your roosts, and you can only build 1 roost per clearing. So it became very difficult, and you had to be very careful as to how you program that. So that was a pretty fun puzzle for me, and it was cool to see how that worked out. Chris, you have any thoughts on that?
I actually thought that your faction was the most interesting, and it's the one that I would like to try because I think that mechanism is so cool. And I'm going to talk about theme again for a minute because I think that this kind of ties in so closely. But the story behind this game, for those who haven't played it before, is that the birds used to be the masters of the forest and they kind of went into turmoil, and then the cats came in and took over, and then you've got the Woodland Alliance that's, sick of being oppressed by both of them. But the birds, the story behind the mechanism that Adam just talked about is the birds can't get themselves organized because they all want to be in charge. And so you pick a leader and you have to lay out your battle plan. And if you have to be able to execute all the pieces of your battle plan, and if you do, you're going to be successful and you'll get to build on that, and it's going to be tremendously beneficial in future rounds. If you're not able to execute that battle plan, your fickle followers are going to get sick of you and overthrow you and send you into turmoil and start all over again. And that's just one of those moments where the theme of this game I think is pretty brilliant. But I do love that mechanism, and I think the thinking ahead of that is pretty cool. There's also the otters, which we didn't play tonight, but it's another one that I think is really kind of neat, where you have these folks that are. The otters are kind of like the
merchants, kind of, right?
Merchants, yeah, the merchants. Like they'll start at the start of your turn. You get to decide: do you want to buy a card from the otters? The otters will also sell you the opportunity to use their riverboats to move around on the rivers, which you can't normally do. Or you can buy their troops to be your mercenaries in battle. And there's all these little pieces of story that I think are fitted in there so beautifully. And they tie in so nicely with mechanism, which is always something that I enjoy, that I think I think it's brilliantly done.
Yeah, I agree, but we're talking about mechanisms and not theme.
We are, but we're talking about mechanisms and theme.
Yeah, totally.
That is seamless. That makes it even better.
Now, I do have one other mechanism I want to talk about, but I did want to mention that I called out the birds because I do think that's very clever. It's a very clever little game that you're playing there. But with my experience with the other three base factions, none of them are very fun to play, in my opinion. Like, again, very limited experience here. One play of the Woodland Alliance today, and I've had a play of the Cats before, and I have a decent sense how the Vagabond plays. But Woodland Alliance, yeah, I was doing stuff, but it wasn't very interesting stuff. Like turning in cards of a certain suit to blow up an area, turning in cards to create something. It was fine, but I think that's one of the reasons why this game hasn't gotten me excited to be like, I want to get back and learn it. Because it's really just like turning suits in on a card to do something to just move a point tracker. And other than the birds, I'm not finding any of those activities to be very enjoyable or entertaining. And maybe that would come with getting to know it better and really just getting into the game itself. But the gameplay wasn't very fun for me. Chris, you played the Cats. This is your second time playing it. Did you have fun playing the Cats?
I think it's okay. I mean, I think it's the most traditional of the factions in terms of area control. But one of the things that's frustrating about playing the Cats is you start spread out all over the board. So basically the entire first half of the game is just people culling you out of all the different places where you've got one character that aren't near your keep, your stronghold. It gets pretty frustrating because you're just getting beat down a lot. There's also a lot of opportunities to score, relatively easy points by putting out buildings. I mean, I think it's okay. I don't love that one. I would really like to try a game with a different faction. I might find it unsatisfying the way that you did with the Woodland Alliance, but it's something I'd be interested in trying, certainly.
Let me talk about one more good thing here, and then I'll let you guys go on because I don't have anything else to say about mechanisms. The one other thing that is kind of fun here is that at least the cards are multi-use. Most of them, you're just discarding them to use the suit on them. That's not very fun. But a lot of the cards do have things. You can build the cards. So if you have... Each of the factions builds it in a different way. But if you're able to build a card, you can either get some points for it. But in some cases, you can actually build special abilities. Like I had 4 ongoing abilities on my... on my faction map by the end of the game just by building these cards. So, I thought that was clever. It was fun to, have that decision space to, do I save it for the card ability or do I save it for the dominance check later or do I save it for the suit? So, yeah, that's one other thing I enjoyed about the mechanisms here.
What do you guys think about the going for the dominance victory? Was that... I've had that before in a game, and it can bring someone like Chris tonight who was 10 points down or however many points back, give him a legitimate chance to be in contention. So I do like that dominance victory condition. I thought that was kind of a neat aspect of the game.
I think it's good that it's there. And it was fun to see Chris. He picked up that dominance check and then he threw all his troops on the 3 spaces hoping to hold them until the next round. And I thought that was cool. So yeah, I think it's good for a game like this.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting too. In fact, what I found really enjoyable about it this game was the fact that I had half as many points as you guys did. You guys were all like 20 something and I was at like 12, I think. And so I was doomed, except I was able to position myself for this dominance victory potentially. And I think it would have been pretty tough to knock me off that, except the fact that Steve was able to push his victory in with those 8 points or whatever he did in the last turn. So I kind of went instantly from going from dead ass last to being a real contender for the winner of the game. So, and it was something, and it's not like it was a random card that I drew that got me there, because that would be a lot less fun if it was just a random thing. But these cards, these dominance cards, were all sitting out there for everybody to select at that point and to see what the options were. So I don't know. I thought that was a neat thing. I enjoyed that.
That's always been kind of a neat mechanism to me. Isn't there a caveat too? You have to have at least
10 points.
10 points in order to go for a dump. Yeah,
something.
I think that's cool too. Yeah.
Yeah, make some progress first.
Right.
Also, probably just so that somebody can't like just take the game in the first three rounds or something like that.
Right.
You at least have to get to a certain point before you can do it.
Sure.
Hey, the one other thing I want to talk about real quick on this, just because it's a factor in so many games that we played, and we've talked about it so much recently, is the combat mechanism. In this game, it's an area control game. Combat is a frequent activity, and it's relatively impactful. But I gotta say, this is probably one of the most uninteresting, boring combat mechanisms in any game I've ever played. It's essentially, you're rolling 2 dice, the attacker takes the higher of the 2 dice, the defender takes the lower of the 2 dice, and then you kill off that many troops on each side. And it's extremely streamlined, but it's also very boring. Now, I'm not saying that necessarily is a huge negative, because there's so much combat here that if you had a really drawn out combat with cards, drawing cards and making choices every time like you do in so many games, this could get really unwieldy. And so this is very streamlined. It's very efficient. And there's so much combat happening that maybe I assume that was intentional, that they're trying to make it so you can just breeze through these things. And even losing combat is not a tremendously impactful thing, in the sense that if you lose a couple troops and you lose a spot, you might be able to come in, take it right back again the next time. So it was not super exciting, but maybe it didn't need to be. But I thought it was worth mentioning just because it is something that we talk about so much in these types of games.
Yeah, I ended up using the combat as started looking for targets of opportunity. If I go in and there is a tie, worst case scenario, I'm going to lose 2 guys, Chris is going to lose 2 guys. Am I still going to get a point out of it? Is it still going to be to my advantage, even if numbers come out the same? So that was kind of my thought process here. But right, it's just quick. That's the best thing I can say about it. There wasn't much intricacy. There was, I think, a little bit of abilities. Tim's faction had one where he always got the higher die, or maybe as a defender, he got the higher die. And then I had one of my bird leader guys gave me +1 hit on my roll. So a little bit of advantage. That's as the attacker. Not too much to it. Quick and uninvolved, really.
Yeah, and there were some cards you could play that would give you a surprise attack and take out 2 guys. But yeah, I agree, Chris, it's very uninteresting. Also very streamlined. What I don't understand about it is why the rules are written so poorly that it took us like 25 checks to the rule book every time there was a combat for us to understand what was going on. and that's kind of like I think I understand why they did this with the rule books the way they did. They've got the rule of root or whatever, the law of root or whatever, which is kind of the rule book where you would go back and reference it. But it was so hard to read, referencing through these different like numbered sections of the board, and even combat. You said it's streamlined and quick, except there's like six steps that you have to go through in that, and it shouldn't have been written that complicated, and it shouldn't have been as hard to follow what was happening. So I think it's more an issue with just the way the rules are presented here. And I think in some ways the asymmetry, there's complication added in places that it doesn't need to be just to make it more asymmetric. Like the Woodland Alliance had a different rule on that combat. It was like every single thing that was in the core rulebook had to be changed for at least one faction. So we really never knew what was going on until you went and looked at the factions rules and you looked at the base rules. And a lot of them were very unnecessarily complicated. You're talking about the combat being streamlined, and it seemed like it should have been boring, but it didn't feel streamlined. It felt clunky for some reason, probably because of the rules of what has to be damaged first and then where you get points. For something that could have been more streamlined or more fun, it kind of missed both those marks. But once we got the hang of it, I mean, it worked. It made some sense. It gave you a reason to go after a region with buildings in it because that's where you're going to get points from. But first, you have to get through the troops. So it works. I'm sure this is something that would come all together after a couple more plays. But on a first play, it wasn't a great experience.
Well, if we're shifting into theme and production here, that ties in to the player boards. A lot of people, I've heard this said before, like, you don't have to know the rules. Just look at your player board. All the rules are right there on your player board. Well, not necessarily.
Yeah.
Like all the rules except for some key details that you got to go flip through the rule book for, which was like, oh, it's so frustrating. If you're going to put all these wacky rules, like just, I don't know. Maybe they ran out of room. There's already a lot of text on these player boards as it is anyway that kind of guides you what to do. And not every rule is on there. You got to go back and fish around in the rule book.
I totally agree with you, Adam. It was like for each faction, there were several actions they could take where it was mostly spelled out on the board, but it did miss some key details that we had to go reference. And so once you know the key details that you have to go reference, you're never reading the text on the board anyway, so why put it there? So that was a big miss. I totally agree with you on that. Because it could have been, it was so close, like a few more words in a few more spaces, and we wouldn't have had to reference the rule book for half the things we had to reference.
Yeah.
And we wouldn't have even known except that we watched like a how to play video before playing. So
Right.
if we'd sat down without like, memorizing the rule book and then just worked with that text on the faction boards, we would have missed half a dozen rules. So yeah, that was unfortunate.
Yeah. I hate going to the rule book. I almost take pride in the fact that I almost never look at the rule book when we're doing this because I hate doing it so much. And I must have spent like a half hour looking at the rule book in this game. So,
yeah.
I just felt like a stumbling, bumbling fool half of the time trying to get through this and like these little micro rules that applied only to my faction or only applied to the faction that I was potentially going to be fighting. And that got a little bit frustrating after a while.
Agreed. Now, I want to go back to the theme, though, and I actually really liked everything that was being done thematically here. Adam, you said you felt like it felt a little opaque, but like the Woodland Alliance, they're the rebels, right? They're starting to put some influence into regions and grow support. And then every once in a while, there will be an uprising and things explode. Every time a group of troops comes into the region, they pick up, you have to give me a card to go as one of my supporters. They've just picked up a supporter. They've kind of raised their support because there's troops coming through here. All the thematics tied in there. The vagabond, he's moving around. He's like pretending to start alliances with people, but he could end them at any time. He's trading with people, kind of doing his own thing. Like I could feel like these woodland critters moving around through this game and then doing the actions that we were doing. And if the actions were as fun to play as the story they told, I think it would have been a really, really cool experience for me. But I didn't quite have that fun with the mechanisms that I was getting from the theme. But I did think that the theme worked, really worked well.
I see what you're saying, but in practice, I see, okay, there's this yellow or there's an orange faction, the cats, that are on the map, and what are they doing? They're doing these buildings, okay, and they have recruiting stations, okay, and they get more guys, and then the sawmill, okay, they have a sawmill, that's cool, and they make some wood. All right. Yeah. Okay. 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 There's an orange team that makes wood and builds some stuff and gets some points. All right. And then there's the green guys that put out some fists and blow some stuff up. When I see what they're actually doing, it doesn't make sense. There's a fist and they blow stuff up, and now there's like 3 more dudes out there and they get some points. All right, that's cool. And then like my guys, like, all right, they build some nests and they get some points for nests.
Oh. Chris, tell Adam why he's wrong here, because we're gonna get railed on for that commentary.
Oh, man, no, I gotta say, I hate to say it, but I agree with Tim on this one. I think that the theme is worked in beautifully. In fact, I can't think of another game that I've played where there isn't so much built-in story to it, which I absolutely love. I mean, and it really is. I mean, okay. So you've got the cats who are they're the colonists. They're trying to colonize. They're taking over. They're trying to move out and build as many things as they can. You've got the birds that are the former rulers that are kind of have gone all crazy because they can't get their stuff together, and they want to take back power, and so they're trying to reestablish themselves. Over these cats that are kind of stepping in and taking over things, which, cats actually do in the real wilderness. And You've got the woodland animals who, are sick of all of this. Then you start taking in these other, the other factions like the river folk who are in there just to make a buck, and the lizards who are these, these religious fanatics. It doesn't necessarily make sense faction by faction looking at it from the perspective of, well, why are the lizards the religious fanatics? But if you take it as these are all the sort of standard groups of characters in so many stories that we all love to read or watch movies or what have you, and they put a animal face on it. The cats are the Empire, the Woodland Alliance is the Rebellion, etc. I think it works so perfectly. Just don't look at it as, well, how come the cats are building sawmills? I think that's a little bit too fine of a brush to try to take that down.
I don't know. I that's the thing with me. I feel like there's cool stuff that happens, and I feel like it should be making some kind of sense, but then it just doesn't make any sense. Like none of the stuff makes any sense to me, and that's I think what's so frustrating. It doesn't make any sense. So you guys say that the theme is there. To me, it totally isn't there. Like there's, it makes no sense to me.
Hilarious.
Oh man. Right. Haven't you had stuff stolen by a raccoon before?
No, dude. Like raccoons are just cute. They come and hang out with cats. I used to live in Sacramento, and the raccoon would be eating cat food right there with the cat on the porch.
Haven't you ever been proselytized to by a lizard?
Well, that you make a fair point there. That happens all the time.
All right. Well, let's talk about the art, because this is another area where I think this game really shines. And obviously, it's an area that drew me into the game originally, made me want to pay attention to it. I love Kyle Ferrin's art here. I think it is so cute and so clever. It's abstracted in a way, but I think it's so unique and great. What do you guys think about the art here?
I am so sick of cute little wooden creatures trying to be gentle and cuddly and be my friend, and this doesn't make sense either. Like, they're supposed to be warriors fighting it out in the forest, and they're like these little cuddly guys. Like, no, come on, man. Like,
they're cuddly guys with knives.
Adam, did you have a rough day today? I feel like you had I feel like you're coming into this with
seriously,
a bad
man.
No, you know what? It's
okay. You're unhappy with the game, but go back to the art for a second. You don't think that the art style is unique and like it doesn't? Do you not like it? I can understand too, like because I do think it is. It has an element of feeling a little bit like not finished, but
I think it's okay in doses. But I've seen Kyle Ferrin art shoved into my face in Root and in Oath. And in Fort, and it's the same every time. So
wow.
if it wasn't for all the follow-on games, it wasn't for like so much Kyle Ferrin art that's the same style over and over and over again, then yes, this art's pretty good. But now it's just like eating too much pumpkin pie. We just had Thanksgiving, right? It's like it's good the first few bites, and then you're just like, oh, I can't take any more of this. I feel horrible.
You just reminded me that I've got pumpkin pie in the fridge, and I totally forgot about it. I had some of that after the show.
Man, I think that you've lost your mind. I think this game I think this game is so clever. I love the art. I love seeing this, like, there's a card where it's you get an extra battle action, and it's called like Command Warren is the name of and it's got a little rabbit sitting there with his map laid out in front of him. He's drinking a cup of coffee and working on his battle plan. I think that is so freaking awesome.
Yeah.
I absolutely love it. Now, having said that, I haven't played Oath. I haven't really played Fort, so I haven't been kind of overdosed with this art yet, but this game, I think this is absolutely one of the high points of this game. It is so freaking fun and enjoyable. And you add that to the story that's happening here, which I won't say more about because I already said enough about it. But you put those two together, and I think that is an amazing thematic package.
Yeah, I agree. I think, Chris, it's not only just the art, but even on every card, how the art and then the name ties into it. They all tell a story, and I think it's great. So 100% agree.
Well, what do you guys think about the language here and the vocabulary used in the rule book and on the player boards?
What do you mean?
Is to me, I'm gonna say that felt like another barrier to me.
It's a barrier.
I'm trying to find my player board.
Yeah.
I read that little passage about the way that the Irie works to begin with. There's something about you have to set up your viceroy in order to get the sigil to do the concierge, to go down to delve amongst the fiefdoms and do this thing. So like, okay, I get it. You know fancy words, dude. Like, just tell me what I'm supposed to do.
I agree with you. It you know, what they're trying to do here is bring more theme in here, and it I think it does when you know the game. But I think it is a barrier. I think this whole game is not. It's not. It has no intent of trying to be easy. And that's a shame, because I think for me that is an immediate turnoff. And the language that's used, instead of using, you know, kind of standard language across the factions, and instead of just saying something by giving it a keyword and then describing the keyword, it just overcomplicates the reference to everything. I think that's what made it so hard to read the language on how a battle works and understand how it's written. And there were so many things that was just hard to check because you were just trying to refer to these weird keywords that didn't translate easily without really looking into them. So Adam, I think that's you finally have a fair complaint about the theme and mechanism.
Well, but here's another potential complaint. I'm curious to hear what you guys have to say about the actual physical production of this game, not the art, but everything else.
Yeah, I've played with this and I think it's gorgeous. I think it's cute, and I like the little wooden components that are all screen printed, and I like the cards. I like the player boards. In fact, aside from just some of the text in weird situations being missing from the player boards, I think the player boards are really cool. The way they're laid out, the way the tokens all, you know, align with stuff. I love the production on this game. I think it's fantastic. But Chris, you had a complaint about it. What was it that you didn't like?
I'm not sure it's a complaint, because I don't necessarily disagree with you that it's pleasant. It's basic in the sense that there is very little in.
It's not enough plastic for you.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, sorry, but that is the fact. I mean, there's a bunch of little meeples in the shape of, you know, sort of in the shape of a cat, or sort of in the shape of a raccoon or whatever. But other than that, it's a big box of cardboard punch outs, and you know, and it looks nice. I'm not busting on it that hard, because it's not an unpleasant game to play. It's certainly a pleasant game to look at, but for an area control game, maybe I'm just spoiled. You know, you got these, you know, badass games like Ankh, which I didn't love the game, but I loved the production. I mean, the production was amazing. This one, I almost feel like inappropriately maybe, I want to see more of that kind of stuff, even though it doesn't. I mean, there's nothing about the game that strictly requires that, but it just almost seems like a prerequisite for an area control game.
No, I think it's one of the charms here, and we don't need more big gray plastic, especially when you're dealing with a light woodland creature theme. I think that the artwork and the little wooden components work perfectly.
This is where I'm with Tim on this one. The little chits here and the tokens and the little creatures. Sometimes a big gray plastic just gets in the way, and I prefer in a game like this, if they're going to shove all this cutesy art in my face, get rid of the gray plastic minis and have the wooden little screen printed troops running around out there on the map.
Yeah, and I gotta say too that with this game which is a huge game and is going to give the right group a ton of gameplay. I think the MSRP on this is like $40, and it's in a 35 bucks, and it's in a small box. Everything is packed in there snugly.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
Especially considering you have to have multiple rule books to actually navigate this game, but it all fits in there, and I think it's a great little package, a great production, and one of the strengths of the game.
Yeah, I will say, I don't say this very often in our discussions, but you guys have convinced me. I mean, the more I think about it, like, what would you do with a big plastic mini of a raccoon, right? It actually helps it probably having something a little bit more abstract, a little bit more cutesy and small, and not epic. So yeah, you guys, I think you guys make a really good point. I'm convinced.
So Adam, what was your most memorable moment of Fruit?
I guess my most memorable moment of this game, I don't know. I think it was when I figured out how to do my turns extra fast, and I could accelerate the pace of the game. So my faction started to click for me. I was like, oh, I'll put these like bird cards on my little programming thing so I can just do whatever I want. I don't have to worry about the restrictions. So I can go boom, 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 get this done, go in here, get some points, and now I'm rolling. So once I got to that point where I was rolling along, not to say that I was trying to end the game quicker, but going from Steve's vagabond turn where he had to plan like A to B to C to D.
80.
And I was like, oh God, come on, man. Like, and then it got to my turn. I'm like, I'm going to do this. Choom, 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 choom. 5-6 points. Done. So I started, feeling pretty good once I was able to make that click and get it rolling. So that moment when I got to accelerate the gameplay a little bit felt good for me. The frustrating part was I had no idea what anyone else was trying to do, and I didn't want to learn. So, I didn't want to take the time to be like, Tim, what is this guy? And I tried doing that, and everyone's like, shut up, Adam, just do your thing. I'm like, fine. I am fine. I'll go over here. So that was kind of how the game went for me. What about you, Chris?
I think for me, that was an easy one. And I alluded to this before, but it was about, I don't know, not even 3/4, like 8/10 of the way through the game. And I was so far behind. I mean, it was sad and embarrassing how far behind I was. But I grabbed up that dominance card and was, I guess potentially on the route to victory in my next turn when Steve stepped up and scored a ridiculous amount of points in one turn that none of us saw coming. So I went from utter sadness to joy and gloating to utter sadness in the course of like 5 minutes. And I don't know. I think that maybe that says something good or something bad about the game. I don't know. But that the fact that there was that much of a swing in that short of time certainly says something. Yeah. Tim, what about you?
Yeah, so there's two things I'll mention here. From a moment perspective, it was definitely the end game. And what I was surprised by throughout the game is I would feel like I had an awesome turn. I had a revolution and I got all these points in this one turn. I jumped ahead of everybody. And then by the time it came back around to me, everybody else was at the same points. And other than Chris kind of falling behind there, that's how it felt the whole game. Everybody just had pretty much equal movements up. And I think that's part of what made it not fun to do the mechanisms, because it just felt like you were doing things, even though they were different than what other people were doing, they just led to the same thing repeatedly. And so coming into that last round where I was like, hey, I'm set up, I think I've got a couple big points I'm going to be able to make, I might be able to end this turn. And Steve did the same thing, and I think Adam probably could have won on his turn, and then Chris could have gotten the dominance check on his turn. And so it was a surprise that he won, because I didn't really know what he was doing over there, what his capabilities were exactly. It didn't surprise me that much, because I don't think anyone knew that I had the chance to win on my turn either. We're all doing these things and getting points. And I think that's kind of what led me to my second thought here, is that most of what I was thinking through the game is I wish this was over. I wish that I hadn't suggested we play this game tonight for the sake of the podcast, because I didn't have, I'd been through this before. I'd gone through all the work of learning it and recognizing that I didn't think the game was worth coming back to enough. I moved that out of my collection. This was actually a gift from a good friend of mine who went into a local game store. Him and his girlfriend at the time, now wife, they walked into a local game store and said, hey, we've got some friends that are into games and we want to play 4-player games with them. What would you recommend? And this game store suggested they buy Root. That was the dumbest freaking sale I've ever heard in my life, because he gave it to me. I was excited because I got a chance to play this new game that was hot, and I learned it. And I was like, John and Courtney are never going to play this game, and my wife will never play this game with me. And they sold this to somebody who was buying a gift for their gamer friends, but to play with them who are non-gamers or not serious hobby gamers. Anyway, long diatribe saying that I moved that out of my collection back then because I didn't think it was going to be worth the effort. And tonight I sat through it, struggling through the rule book, waiting for everybody else to figure out their turns, and it was definitely not worth it. So that's kind of my feeling most of the night tonight.
That's a funny story, Tim, about the game store. I've seen that same thing at a game store in Pasadena. Some a group of probably not so seasoned gamers come in, and the guys, oh, look at this game, Root, and you look at the box and these cute creatures, and you're like, oh, that's going to be a fun game. I'll pick that up, $35, and I'll go play with it with my friends. Throw that rule book in front of them and see how long that lasts. It's going to be a tough sell to someone that's not an experienced board game person. So that's just the unapproachability. Yeah. I mean, it looks approachable, but is it approachable? Not at all. It's not very approachable. So
no, this game is not going to turn somebody into a gamer. That's for sure.
One thing I should mention is that there is a second rule book that kind of walks you through, I don't remember. I went through it when I first learned it, but I think it walks you through a couple rounds for each faction. And I think that's a nice way to introduce something this heavy, but really not a nice way for a group of friends who are kind of getting together to try to, get in and play it for the first time. It was really hard to learn this game tonight. All right, cool. Well, let's go into our final question. Would you request to play this game again? And I'm going to start here. Should be no surprise based on my comments here. I'm not going to, and I probably will turn it down if somebody suggests playing it.
Wow.
It probably would have been a better experience if I'd sat down with a group who already knew how to play it and could kind of fill me in and teach it. I think that would have gone probably much better. But like I said, just the activities that you're doing here, I didn't have much fun doing the activities of the game. There were a few clever moments, but I just didn't find it that exciting or that fun to play. But what about you, Chris? Would you request to play it again?
Man, what a tough one, because, and I feel like I'm sort of turning things on their head here, because we played recently, the last game we played was Ankh. And in Ankh, there were so many things that were done brilliantly, but there were one or two huge things wrong, at least in my opinion, that would turn me away from the game. Whereas this one, there were so many things that were like minor frustrations, and yet I think I would ask to play this game again. Now, I also had two very different experiences in my two games of it. And the first one was playing it with a group of people who were, super well versed in the game, knew all the details, were able to kind of set me straight, and there's no need to keep going back to the instruction book because everybody already knew the rules, and that was it was streamlined, it was more fun, and I actually ended up winning that game, surprisingly. With our group, all due respect to you guys, but I mean, we were definitely we were struggling. I mean, we were trying to figure out the game as we were playing it, even though we'd all learn some of the rules to it. So I think that was a very different experience. Now, that said, it feels to me like there's enough here that I do want to play this again. And the first time I played it, I had a very similar experience. As I was playing it, I'm going, man, I don't know about this. But then it was like a brain worm. It got into my head after the game was done, and I kept thinking about, well, maybe I should try this, or maybe this would be interesting. And I still feel that way now. So I think I want to play it again. I think if it didn't get more accessible after another game or two, then it probably would not be worth it. And I guess in reality, I mean, you guys are, the primary folks I'm playing games with, and, the chances that we're going to keep getting this back on the table is extremely slim, especially now that Tim has said, I will decline this game, which I think is the first time anybody on this podcast has ever said that. So yeah, I think with the right circumstances, I would ask to play this one again, but it's not one that I would necessarily be clamoring to get back to the table. But I think there's enough there that I'm interested in exploring it more.
And let me just qualify one thing, and that is that if it's the four of us playing a game and it's your game night pick, it's not like I'm not going to come to game night because you got this game on the table. What I'm saying is that if there's like two games set up and somebody's like, hey, Tim, we got an open spot, come play Root with me, I'll be like, no, let me go check out what's on that other table there. So, there's nothing that I'm going to decline. There are a couple games that I never want to play again. This isn't as bad as even some of those, but I'll even play those with you if that's the only game that's on the table and somebody wants to draw me into.
I mean, we know that is like a basic law of physics. Tim will never say no to a game.
Exactly. Game night has to happen. It is a law. All right, Adam, what about you?
Yeah, for me, this game is, I will not request to play it again, and I think it is a try to avoid game for me. It's just an exercise in frustration and a little bit excess overeating of a pumpkin pie. It just gets to me in all the wrong ways. It's funny, Chris, you make some comparisons to Ankh when you were talking about it, and that game to me gave me the brain worm. There's so much that I thought about after the fact, and so many combinations, and so much emergent gameplay that game has me interested, and I might go back and buy that one now. Having said that, I can see that Root has all of those things as well. The more you explore the factions, you're going to realize what you can do and how you could have played smarter and how you could have moved stuff around. And, I need to do this to counter this guy's faction, to counter this guy's faction. And you can build and build and build and really get some high-level play. And again, that's just not something I want to put in the upfront work into. Maybe I'm just lazy. Maybe I'm not smart enough to make it all click together. But it's not a game for me.
Hey, let me ask you guys a question. I want to compare this to the one other asymmetric game that we did review, which was Robotech Reconstruction. How did that compare to you? Because I had played Root once before, and when we played that and we reviewed it that night, I think I was the one that said, I find this more fun than Root.
You did.
And that definitely holds true for me tonight after playing this again. Like, I had a fun time, even with our first game of Robotech Reconstruction. I found it more approachable. I found it more fun. I found the scoring, the end game goals that each faction was doing, even though the gameplay was probably a little less asymmetric, the end game conditions were more asymmetric. It was more interesting to watch what was going on. It was more interesting to conflict with the other players. Like everything about it was more fun to me. How did you guys feel on that comparison?
I could not agree with you more, Tim. I think I jumped on your bandwagon when we were talking about Robotech Reconstruction. I said I enjoyed it more than Root as well, and I stick to that. That game was so much more fun compared to tonight's play and any of the plays that I've had. So yeah, I don't know what it is about it, but it just makes more sense to me. It clicks more, and it's just more engaging to me. Chris, what about you?
It's definitely more accessible, no doubt about that. I feel like it feels to me like comparing apples and oranges to some degree because of the fact that that is so accessible and there is so much variety in Root. So there's a million different factions you can play in Root, a million different variations. And if that appeals to you, then there's a lot more depth there that you can get into. If you're looking for a game you just throw down the table and have a good time with, and Robotech Reconstruction probably is a better choice. The one thing I found that I didn't care for as much, I don't remember what I said about it at the time, but with that game, there was the forced kind of semi-co-op nature of it with the other player. That wasn't my favorite mechanism. It also has the challenge of being basically a 4-player game. You can play it with 3 players, but it's not ideal. You have to have at least 3, but you really ought to have 4. So that was a thing as well. If I was playing the game with someone other than hardcore Root players, I'd probably rather play Robotech Reconstruction.
Yeah, that's a valid point. The one thing I think is worth noting, though, is that you can't say that Root has all these different factions to play. I mean, there was a base game that came out, and then there were expansions added on later on. Kickstarters that you had to back and wait a year and a half for. So, yeah, there are more factions out today.
True.
But as the core game of these 4 factions, my feelings still stand. I think, and again, who cares? We're not reviewing Robotech Reconstruction tonight. It's just like, it's interesting for me to think back and say, like, is it just that I don't like games that are this asymmetric?
Yeah.
And I think there's a good comparison to be made there. And I just had a lot more fun with that. I found the differences in the factions and how they played to be very different, but close enough. And the terminology that was used across factions was close enough to where I felt it was just easier to get into and just more fun, like easier to just get into the fun part of the game.
I get you.
And not the frustrating part of the game.
No, I totally understand.
Yeah. All right, cool. Well, I think that will wrap up our review of Root. Just remember, it's just our opinions. If you love Root, don't flame us for it. That's how we felt after today's game.
Or flame us if you feel you need to. That's okay too. You do you.
Sure, yeah, except I'm the one that's got to deal with all the social media. All right, well, we're going to jump into a Root-themed cocktail as well as some games that we've had on our table right after this. All right, welcome back. So, Chris, share with us what we should be drinking while we're playing Root.
Yeah, so Adam trashed the art in this game. I mean, it is cutesy. There's little woodland animals, and they're scampering while they're stabbing people with their daggers and all that kind of good stuff. But in reality, at its heart, this game is all about power and politics and revolution. And the cats have the power, the birds used to have it, and they want to get it back, and the Woodland Alliance is just pissed off at all of them because it's tired of being oppressed. So today's cocktail was inspired by another famous revolutionary, Che Guevara. Most folks are familiar with the name, and almost everybody has seen some version of the photo portrait of Che looking defiant and revolutionary, and I'm sure that you guys can picture in your minds the picture. And Adam,
yeah, if I may jump in here,
please do.
The artist that did the Che Guevara, the famous Che Guevara, is the artist that did the art for Inish.
You're kidding.
I'm not kidding. Jim Fitzpatrick is the artist who did the Che Guevara poster and also the artist who does the art for Inish.
Back in late 1968?
Yeah, same artist.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, well that is an awesome game tie-in I did not know about. But yeah, and actually that was based on a photograph that I forget who, but some college history department suggested that photo that came from maybe the most famous photograph in the world. But so what that made me think about was how everybody knows the face, but a lot of people don't know the backstory of this guy. And it's really a pretty epic backstory. He became a revolutionary as a young man, and during a motorcycle trip across South America in his 20s, Che was appalled by the poverty that he saw, and he turned to Marxist-Leninist philosophy. And there's actually a very well-received 2004 movie about this trip that's called The Motorcycle Diaries. So if anybody's interested in digging more into that history. But to make a short story ridiculously short and oversimplified, he later met Raul and Fidel Castro and became a very integral part of the Cuban Revolution of 1959. And for a time, he was even Castro's second in command. So after the revolution, he became a really important member of the new Cuban government. And the rest, as they say, is history. To some, he's a hero. To others, he's a villain. But he's undoubtedly one of the most famous revolutionaries of all time. And so appropriate for tonight's cocktail, which is called Che's Revolution. And it was invented by bartender Ben Reed in 2003. So here's what you're going to need. 2 ounces of light rum, 1.5 ounces of pineapple juice, 1/4 ounce of maple syrup. Yes, maple syrup. And 4 mint leaves. So this is a super duper simple drink to make. You're going to put all of those ingredients, including the mint leaves, into a shaker with some ice, shake it heartily, strain that into a cocktail glass, and viva la revolucion. Our Woodland Alliance would be proud of us.
Nice, Chris. I freaking love all of your drink stories.
Yeah, and Chris, I saw that movie, The Motorcycle Diaries. Fantastic movie and really inspiring and makes you stand up for what the cause was there. But I think it's also worth noting that Che Guevara, as well as obviously his, Fidel Castro, and communist regimes are put in place, but then they fight for power, and a lot of people get killed. Human rights issues come out of that as well. So I don't think we can just romanticize that time and era as well as inspiring as some of their early ideologies and plans were.
Oh, absolutely not. In fact, when I did my test of this cocktail, because this is a new one to me, I ran the test with a friend who is of Cuban American descent. And so there was a little bit of interesting discussion about him as a historical figure. And so it's the commentary there is neither pro or con anything that he did as a revolutionary, but just as a historical figure, a fascinating person, and clearly a revolutionary squirrel.
Yeah, and also I was gonna say it brings back into what we were in the middle of Root, and I was playing the Woodland Alliance and mentioning how obviously I was the good guys here, and everyone else is like, no, you're the terrorists, and it's always perspective. I'm not, who's on what side, who's the good guys, who's the bad guys.
I've always got the Expanse on my mind now, and so they're the OPA of
that's right,
of the Root universe.
All right, cool. Well, let's move on and talk about some games that have been on our table this week. So, Adam, why don't you start us off?
Yeah, Thanksgiving, I brought, after we had all the tasty food and turkey and candied yams and broccoli salad, which was surprisingly delicious, I busted out Azul with my dad. We played two-player games, and I hadn't played this game in a few years. So going back to it, this game had gotten even better than I remember. You know how you can go away from something, you get a kind of a fresh perspective on it when you come back to it? Well, that's what happened here. I had a kind of a fresh lens to look at this game, and I felt it was more nuanced than I remembered it before. There was a lot more going on. The drafting was so much more interesting. The tile placement was cool, how to rack up those points by having your tiles kind of adjacent and building off adjacencies top to bottom when you're sliding the tiles over. Just a great game, light rules overhead, and it just sings right along. That was Azul, a game by, I have it up here, Michael Kiesling, and published by Plan B Games.
Yeah, it's a game that still, every time I play it, it's one I'm happy to play. Still remains fun. Have you thought, Adam, at all about checking out any of the kind of revisions, like the newer versions of Azul?
The only reason I haven't is because the original is so good. I'm sure if I was introduced to one of the revisions, I would happily try it, and it would have to be pretty incredibly awesome for me to want to go buy one of the revisions instead of just the base game. But I would happily play them if presented with the opportunity.
Yeah, I pretty much feel the same way. I don't think I need another one in my collection, but I'm really, really interested. Hopefully one of them shows up in one of these game store events or whatever that I'm doing just so I can try it because I like to see
Right.
what's different about it and how it feels. Because
I've heard they're good. I've heard all the iterations are pretty awesome.
Chris, when are you going to try Azul? Got enough theme going on for you?
I feel like the answer to that is clearly no. Why would I play that game? There's no theme to be had. It's about tiles, period.
That's true.
All right. Well, what have you been playing this week that's much more thematic than Azul?
We've actually been doing a deep dive in my family into Risk Legacy. And the reason we got started on that was because we were staying at we took a short vacation, a long weekend a couple weekends ago. And there happened to be a Risk game in the house that we rented to stay in. We busted it out, and my wife and son and I played a couple of games of it. We had a really fun time. And so, of course, that immediately made me feel opportunistic and like, well, how can I parlay this into some real gaming experience? I looked up Risk Legacy because I knew it was out there. What I didn't realize was the history that is, there with Risk Legacy, which incidentally is by Rob Davio and Chris Dupuis from 2011, and that it was the first Legacy game. I was not aware of that, but after the little bit of research that I did, I saw that that was the first Legacy game. Originally, Rob Davio had proposed to do a Clue Legacy, and that was turned down, but Risk Legacy was picked up, and so that game ended up getting produced. It is similar in so many ways to the basic Risk game, and it will be very familiar to anybody who's played that. You've got a giant map of the world, and you're trying to conquer territories through a very simple dice-based combat mechanism. But there are several things about the Legacy version that are very different. For one, you start in one territory, and then you fan out from there, and you have a headquarters in that territory. Unlike the original game where you populate the map, and then you just start attacking people immediately all over the place. Here, you start in one spot and then start moving out, and so combat doesn't even necessarily happen until several turns into the future. The win conditions are different. In the original Risk, it's basically be the last man standing and you win. In this game, there is a point system essentially where you get points or red stars for doing various things, from taking over somebody's territory with their headquarters, for turning in cards that you get from winning combats, which is one thing that is also very different from the original game. In the original game, you would turn in your combat cards to get troops. Here you're turning them in for points, and the way that you get troops is through another new mechanism in the Legacy game, which is a coin system, where you can get coins either through these territory cards that you get, or from straight coin cards that can be used to turn in for troops. And the more coins you have, the more troops that you can buy with them. Beyond that, there's a lot of very familiar things to Legacy game players. You have these benefits that they're slightly asymmetrical factions, very slightly asymmetrical, I'll repeat, because it is nothing like Root. There's one faction that's slightly more defensive, some defensive benefits, one that's a little bit more offensive benefits, that kind of thing. But of course, the big draw of this game is that it's got that Legacy beauty of getting to open those envelopes and put the stickers on the board, put new faction powers on your card that you get to choose that are specific to your faction, and all that fun stuff, and just how exciting it is when you get to open a new envelope. And I love that about the game. I also like the fact that there are some things like the starting in one territory and then expanding from there that to me feel a lot more engaging, strategic, and thematic than in the original Risk game, which I've always found that to be extremely frustrating. On the downside, really the only things that I can point to, one is that it really does nothing for the combat system in this game. And anybody who's ever played a game of Risk, it's so frustrating when you have somebody gets a bunch of good dice rolls and they just plow through your entire continent and half wipe you off the board because they got a few lucky dice rolls. So there's that. But at least if you've played Risk before, you're familiar with it. That pretty much stays the same. And the other thing is that there's no expectation that you're going to play the same faction throughout the entire campaign. So each game you get an opportunity to pick a new faction. So it was quite frustrating to me that I got wiped off the face of the board in one game by my son, who's bloodthirsty, by the way. And one of the benefits I got from actually being wiped out of the game, which is tougher to do, is you actually get to start repeatedly in this game until there's no place left to start in Risk Legacy. and I got completely wiped out and there's no way for me to come back on. But that gave me a benefit, come from behind power essentially. But by then I was out of the game. The next game, we did our random draw of factions, and my wife chose that faction. So I'm the one who suffered and died to get this benefit, and then she took advantage of it in the next game. I mean, you could fix that by just saying, hey, we're each going to pick a faction and then stick with it throughout the entire campaign. But the fact that they didn't build that in, I thought was kind of lame. Other than that, I thought it was something that was super fun. I understand that there's going to be an even better updated version that's coming out possibly in 2022 called Risk Shadow Forces or something like that, which may improve on it even further. But if you're a Risk fan or you're a gamer who kind of likes Risk, but it's a little bit too boring and standardized and not that exciting, this is a nice way to kick it up a notch. It's a lot of fun. I would definitely recommend it for someone who thinks that sounds appealing. And I'm looking forward to world domination.
Chris, how many games have you played of this so far?
We've played 4 games, I believe.
And do you know how many? Is there like a set number in the box?
Yeah, 14.
Okay, so you got a ways to go.
And so a couple questions for you. How long is each session typically so far?
Surprisingly short, which is another one of the benefits of the Legacy game, is that I think we've never gone more than an hour.
Nice.
For a game, which is, when you start going to that in the standard Risk game, you start getting to that back and forth where I take over 5 of your territories, then you take over 6 of mine, then I take over 7 of your, you're going back and forth.
Right.
And it can go on for hours where nobody really gets the upper hand. I feel like this one was different, and that was a real benefit.
And did you say, or what's like the win condition? How do you win a session, or what? When does a session end?
The session ends when you are the last person on the board, which means that there has to be, you wipe out the other factions and there's nowhere for them to come back in. Because as long as there's an open territory, somebody can come back in the game. And which is a nice mechanism, because then you don't have somebody sitting there going, well, okay, I got knocked out in 15 minutes. Now I'm going to sit here and watch you guys play. The other is to get 4 red stars. And you get red stars by either turning in your combat cards for a star,
okay,
or by taking over one of the enemy factions' headquarters, you get star.
Okay.
I believe there's also, once you get deeper into the game, there are also other ways to get stars as well, but those are the 2 basic ways.
Nice. Cool. Yeah, and that the newer version of Risk Legacy that's coming out, Shadow Forces or whatever it is, I don't think Rob Davio's credited on that. Just
okay.
So it'll be interesting to see. Obviously he kind of invented the genre, and he also created Pandemic Legacy, which is famous, and what he brought, the whole idea of Legacy is fantastic. But now other designers have run with it as well, so I'm sure somebody else can take the reins there.
Yeah.
Well, cool, Chris. Maybe give us an update when the campaign's over and let us know how your thoughts changed. See if the game evolves, and if you're still liking it after 14 games of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. Well, I've got a game that I had a chance to play this week. This game is called Unsettled, and it's by Orange Nebula, which is the publisher of Vindication, which is a game that we reviewed way back on, episode 2, 3, 4, somewhere around there. And it's actually by the same designer, Mark Nidlinger, with a co-designer here, Tom Matson. Unsettled is a cooperative game, kind of the idea being that you are a small ship, a small crew on a ship that has landed on an uncharted planet. It's got some narrative where you have to move around this planet and do certain objectives. The way the game plays out is that each character that's playing is represented with one mini, and then you also have an android mini that characters can control cooperatively. They can take turns moving them. There's a grid of cards that are laid out that represent the different areas of the planet, and so as you explore, as you move around to these different areas, you flip the cards over and it reveals a new terrain, and it might have some new ability that you can trigger on there or whatever. I played the first scenario of this game, kind of the starter one. The mechanisms are, in a lot of ways, remind me of Vindication, and that Vindication is a system where you're basically just moving cubes around, and the story is all told based on where the cubes move to. You move a cube to a space on the map, and it represents a location. You move it to a specific type of card, it represents that you're doing one thing or another. And this is not very different. It is a very, I think, intended to be a modular system with a very abstract mechanism set, where essentially you have a kind of a player board in front of you that represents a few different actions you can take, and every player has 3 dice On your turn, you don't roll these dice. They're actually not even used with 6 sides. Only 4 of the sides are used. So there's basically 4 sides you can use. The other 2 just show the symbol of that particular dice. But each turn you take one of the dice and you have to use it to rest. So you basically have 2 different actions you can take, as well as some free actions. Let me just say that none of those actions are very fun or interesting to do.
Well, hold on, Tim. Look at the. I'm looking at the production of this game and the colors and the artwork. Well, it has to be an amazing game.
Let me get to that.
Yeah, but then Vindication.
No, listen.
Said,
I
right?
liked Vindication a lot, and it does have those issues that it is abstract. Here's where it wins. Okay, this game has really, really fun storytelling that happens when you turn over the card that starts the scenario. The storytelling is witty, it's full of irony, it's full of humor. As you complete one segment, like you'll be given a mission right at the beginning, it kind of tells you what the scenario is, and then you're given one mission. As you complete that, you turn over another card, and there's like a story on it. So the writing in it was great in this first one. We were laughing, we were joking around about it. The artwork on the world cards are beautiful, sci-fi fantasy artwork. And the production is full of game trays. Every player element, every player board is a game tray. There's like several shared boards that you pull components from. They're all game trays. That stuff's all great. The gameplay itself was so dull, was so uninteresting, that unless you want to just sit there and play through a story and get to the story elements, I would stay away from this game. I played one scenario of it. Maybe I'm just in a bad mood tonight. This is a game that not only would I probably not sit down at a table to play, I would absolutely not sit down at a table to play this game. Now, it is a cooperative game, and you guys know that I'm not a huge fan of cooperative games. But the story elements here and the way that the story escalated as you went through the different scenarios and as you got to one thing, it triggered a new objective for you. What this did remind me of very much, what that element of it reminded me of, was Cthulhu Death May Die. And Cthulhu Death May Die is so much more thematic. The gameplay is so much more fun and interesting that there is no way I would pick Unsettled over that game. So again, if you like cooperative games and you want a fun story telling where you basically are just doing really boring activities to get to the next story elements, then this might be a fun game for you. Obviously, again, listen.
Way to sell it, Tim.
I've read some reviews where people really like this game. So my opinion can't be the absolute here, but I can't see how you would sit through this game and actually enjoy the experience of playing the game. That's my experience with one play again. And it was the starter scenario. Maybe it gets better. Sometimes they keep things a little simpler. I just didn't find it fun at all to get through, other than just when our, kind of the guy who was running the game would pick up one of the story elements and read through it. That was fun. And it painted a very, thematic and very dramatic picture of the world that you're going in. But the turn by turn, taking my turn was just so uninteresting, and waiting for my co-players to take their turns was also very uninteresting. So that was my feeling of Unsettled. I hope to never play it again. If you have played it and feel differently, I'd love to hear about it.
Tim, you've been hitting some duds this week, man. Have you ever played a game called Time Stories?
I have, and it felt a lot like Time Stories to me.
Okay, I played Time Stories, and then that's just exactly how I felt, the way you described it. I was just like, well, this isn't even a game. I'm just like plodding along and reading this little chunk of story, and I died, so I'm supposed to rewind I don't know how many turns and then do it all over again. I
think Time Stories was a much more fun game.
Do you really?
And I don't like Time Stories that much. I would choose not to go play that again either, but I had a more fun time playing that the first time than I did playing this.
Well, that's
wow, okay.
And that was the first scenario, which I think is one of the better ones on Time Stories. I never played any of the sequels, but not for me anyway.
All right.
But I'm really glad that I got a chance to play it now, because I actually almost did back when it was on Kickstarter, because I did like Vindication and I thought they're doing a cool theme here. And I think the only reason I didn't was because when I found out it was co-op, I'm like, I might not dig that. But man, I'm so glad that I didn't end up packing this one. So
it looks like there's like 6 boxes in the main box. Are all those the different scenarios, or what is that?
I think they're the different planets, and then there's like 3 scenarios for every planet.
Okay.
So there's like 18 scenarios you can play in the main box, and then of course they did some expansions with the Kickstarter. Who knows, maybe it changes quite a bit, but the scenario story was fine. The goals that you had in the scenario, I think, that were okay, but just the basic actions that you're taking on your turn were just not fun. And I don't think that's going to change with a different scenario. So unless I'm really missing something here, I would stay away from this one.
18 scenarios of bad.
All right. Well, I think that will wrap us up today. If you'd like to chat with us, let us know what we got right. Let us know what we got wrong. But don't let us know what we got wrong on this episode.
I'm sure I got lots wrong. It's just, it's not for me.
Okay, so you can find us on Twitter. That's where you're going to be able to chat with all of us the most frequently. But you can find us on other social media channels as well. If you do enjoy our show, please go on Apple Podcasts and rate us. If you hate our show, sure, go ahead and rate us too. But don't do it on this one episode. Go listen to some other episodes if you really just hated our views on Root. Otherwise, until next week, take care, everybody.
Have a good night, everyone.
Bye-bye.